2009. No one's denying that, and we can't contest that. You can't prove a negative. However, this is why the state has the burden of proving who, what, why, and how this happened. They have the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Miller was in fact the one that committed a crime, if a crime was in fact committed. Now, we tried to call into question and suggest that Ms. Thompson's story is just not believable beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you have a doubt, then you must find, a reasonable doubt, then you must find Mr. Miller not guilty. Mr. Miller has entered a plea of not guilty. This means that you must presume that he is innocent. This presumption stays with Mr. Miller until the state proves beyond a reasonable doubt otherwise. Now, the state has the burden. They have the burden of proving that a crime was committed and that Mr. Miller was in fact the person that committed the crime. Mr. Miller is not required to prove anything to you. He is not required to prove that he is innocent. Remember that if you have a reasonable doubt, then you must find Mr. Miller not guilty. You can use your common sense in coming to a decision in this matter. You must base your verdict on the evidence that was presented to you today. You can't base your verdict because you're angry at one witness or feel sorry for the other. Now, to prove the crime of sexual battery, the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Miller had sex with Ms. Thompson without her consent. Now, the judge, Judge Mihant, will tell you that consent means intelligent, knowing, and voluntary consent. In other words, that Ms. Thompson freely agreed or did not freely agree to the act of sexual intercourse. Now, the facts of the January 8th, 2009 are pretty simple. It was an ordinary day for Mr. Miller. He went to work at the Tasty Good restaurant with Mr. Sam Collins at about 10 o'clock after he got off of work. Mr. Miller has worked at Eddie's service station for about 5 years at the time. Eddie's is just a few blocks from Tasty Good. Mr. Miller and Mr. Collins worked together for about 6 months at that time. They would occasionally go out to eat together. Mr. Miller would pretty much eat at the Tasty Good about at least once a week. He was a regular. Ms. Thompson was a waitress there. She was a waitress there for about a year at the time. And whenever Mr. Miller would go to the Tasty Good after 10 o'clock when he would get off of work, Ms. Thompson was the only waitress on duty. Therefore, logically and using your common sense, you can reasonably infer that there's no way that Ms. Thompson has never seen or recognized Mr. Miller before. Now, Ms. Thompson told the Detective Rich that she had never seen Mr. Miller, but using your common sense, you can do the math. While at the restaurant, Mrs. Thompson opened up about her personal life. She poured out her soul to Mr. Miller. Now, both of them were married, and Mr. Miller made the proposal. However, Ms. Thompson agreed. She agreed to meet, and they did meet at around 11 o'clock. Ms. Thompson consented. She freely agreed to meeting with Mr. Miller. Now, Mr. Collins was there. He witnessed Ms. Thompson and Mr. Miller conversing back and forth at the restaurant before they left. The arrangement was simple. Mr. Miller was to wait for Ms. Thompson near an alley just a couple blocks away from the Tasty Good restaurant and from Eddie's. When Ms. Thompson arrived, Mr. Miller honked his horn.
Objection, facts not in evidence.
Sustained. Members of the jury, as I indicated to you previously, at any time your recollection of the evidence should differ from counsel's recitation, it's your recollection that will control. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. They drove around and went to a lot. They had sex. Nobody's contesting that. It was consensual. Miss Miller started crying, and she felt rotten for what she had done, for cheating on her husband. Mr. Miller offered to take her home, but instead, Ms. Thompson denied, and he dropped her off in the alley in which she was picked up shortly before midnight. The total time of this whole rendezvous was less than an hour. Now, as I said before, we concede the fact that they had sex, and both are married. And this is wrong. But you know what? It's not a crime. You cannot and should not use this against Mr. Miller in any way when rendering your verdict at the end of this trial. The real issue here is what happened after Mr. Miller dropped Ms. Thompson off in the alley. If Mrs. Thompson's story is true, it's outrageous that she decided to walk home. It's outrageous that she never thought to call her husband. It's outrageous that she was 3 months pregnant and didn't seem to have an apparent fear for her life or the life of her unborn child.
Objection, speculation, facts not evidence.
Overruled.
As was previously stated, the police were not notified of this until 6 a.m. That is 6 hours that are unaccounted for in this case. As a gap that you can drive a semi-truck through. We've already established that Ms. Thompson felt ashamed for cheating on her husband, and that there's 6 hours between the infidelity and the time that the police were notified. And we will never really know what happened after Mr. Miller dropped Ms. Thompson off in the alley. A quintessential aspect in American society, it's something that we cherish, is the privacy that a husband and wife share in the privacy of one's own home. Now, the reporting officer arrived at 6:20 a.m. He noticed fresh, recent marks on Mrs. Thompson's face, neck, right shoulder, and right arm. The clothes were not ripped or torn. Your obvious question is, why would anyone make this up? This story is frightening. But sometimes what's even more frightening is the truth. There's more to this story than meets the eye. There are missing links. As I said before, we know that Ms. Thompson felt guilty for cheating. Did she confess to her husband what she had done? Why didn't Mrs. Thompson's husband testify at trial today? Why didn't the husband ever call the police? The police weren't notified until 6 a.m. If Ms. Thompson was dropped off at 12, that's 6 hours. He wasn't afraid for the life of his wife and unborn child. We know that when Detective Rich went to go find Mr. Miller the next day, he found him at work. He was just a few blocks from the scene of the alleged crime the night before. If Mr. Miller was truly guilty of a crime, would he go to work the next day? Or would he hightail it? Would he get out of Dodge? And if he was guilty, would he wear an Eddie's jacket the night of the alleged crime? That's a dead giveaway. Ms. Thompson obviously saw the jacket. She would know where to go to find Mr. Miller if he had truly done this. Think about it. Mr. Miller is either the dumbest criminal on the planet or he is not guilty. Now, this is the last time that I'll get the chance to talk to you tonight. I stand here with my co-counsel as lawyers on behalf of Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller has been vilified, punched and kicked with incredible allegations. But you must remember that Mr. Miller is innocent until proven guilty. The state has proved nothing to you today. They have failed to meet their burden of proof. There are holes in their story that you could drive a semi-truck through. The holes are, Ms. Miller claims that she never saw the defendant. Ms. Thompson claims that she never saw the defendant, Mr. Miller. However, we know that Mr. Miller goes to the restaurant at least once a week, and that she's the only waitress on duty when he goes. Use your common sense. Mr. Collins was with Mr. Miller and saw them conversing at the restaurant. We have inconsistent testimony today. Ms. Thompson initially claimed that she didn't know where she was raped, but then she later claimed that it was in an alley. Now,
Objection,
Ms. Thompson.
facts not evidence.
Overruled. Jury will use its recollection with regard to the evidence that was presented. Go ahead.
Now, Ms. Thompson also claims that there was a knife put to her, but to this day, a knife has never been found. Never been found. Again, why would Mr. Miller wear a jacket that has the Eddie's logo on it? officer arrived, he noticed fresh, recent marks on the victim's shoulder, face, neck, and arms. 6 hours after Mr. Miller dropped Ms. Thompson off. This is a he said, she said case. And I ask you, is this enough to convict a human being of a very serious crime? Again, the state has proved nothing to you. And Mr. Miller has no burden to prove anything. In fact, he can't prove anything because this is just a he said, she said case. You must look to the state for the burden. You must focus on the accuser and not on the accused. I urge you to give Mr. Miller back his life, to help repair what reputation he has left. Help right a tremendous wrong and a grave injustice. And do not compromise your views. Do not give in to convenience. Do not give in to anything. Vote your conscience. Sir Thomas More, the king of conscience and a civic leader, which is exactly what you are today, a civic servant, once said that when statesmen forsake their private conscience for their public duties, they lead their country on a short route to chaos. We demand justice, and we urge you to tell the state that Mr. Miller is innocent and that he is not guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, counsel.